I'm Mike and this is Steve, and we run a project called Permanent Culture Now, which is basically a website, and we do lots of talks around the country at festivals and in Bristol, and I help run a monthly film night at the Cube in conjunction with Indie Media. I'm just going to tell you a bit about the project and give you a bit of an idea about what's going on here today as well, because we're hosting this space. Permanent Culture Now came about because me and Steve have known each other for quite a long time, since we went to Ruskin College together in Oxford in '96.
Yeah, 96, 97.
And we've been involved in sort of lots of different stuff for 8 years, which I'll tell you a bit more about. The idea of the project, in a way, was we've learned like loads of stuff over the years, which we found really useful in terms of like promoting social change, and we wanted an outlet really for this information, and we thought it's really important to have sort of a holistic overview of lots of different topics in order to work towards changing the world for a better place, basically. So if you look at the website, we've got like a theory section, history section, permaculture section, commons section, self-reliant, what's the other ones?
Self-reliance, education,
society. Yes, society. There's a film section. So over the last 18 months, we put up about 100 films. So we go to like festivals like Sunrise Off Grid, Clay Cookie Land,
Small is
Beautiful, Bristol Green Week, and we basically try and get in and say, can we come and film all your talks and then stick them up online for people to watch. So if you haven't checked out the site, please take your card and have a look, because there is a lot of stuff on there. But what we're going to do now is we'll just give you a bit of history, and then we'll talk through a bit of some of the ideas of the thinking behind the project and how it could possibly help people who are interested in social change, and we'll sort of show you why we think it's useful to have this sort of holistic view. So if you want to start with a bit of history of us and you.
Yeah, I'll try not to talk too much about us, because you want to give your side. Right, so
can people hear at the back? Yeah,
to talk loud. Yeah. My background, before I met Mike in 1996, I'd been I hate this word, I've been a New Age traveller. And subsequently, due to the rise of neoliberalism, Thatcherism, etc., we all got pushed off the road, battered, vehicles stolen, banged up on trumped up charges, etc. So I found myself back in Manchester, where I was born, and I ended up living in a little 2-bedroom house where it had this amazing south-faced backyard, not Coronation Street type houses. It got full sun, and I had no money at the time. I'd sort of been forced off the road, living off gyros, and I designed a garden based on blagging seeds off people, taking seeds out of vegetables that you bought from the supermarket. I actually emptied a skip full of soil with a rucksack and a mountain bike over 2 days, absolutely manically determined to have this garden. So I set this garden up in my backyard. None of the stuff was paid for, found window frames out, skips, etc. And then when I went to Ruskin College, where I met Mike, there was a permaculture course there. And I went into the permaculture course after about 5 minutes of being in there. It was like, right, that's what I was doing. I could relate to it, and kind of sort of jumped on it from that end. I also spent time in a very politically charged dub reggae band in Manchester. So really, that was my background, and the common ground that when me and Mike sort of started getting to know each other was, we fucking hated the Tories, scum, and we were both into dance music. I mean, I was a musician. Mike writes a lot of digital music, drum and bass, and trip hop, that sort of stuff. So we had these links that sort of brought us together. And I'd always had this thought, we even. We became good friends. We went to University of Bristol with another of our mates who was a Bristolian. So we sort of, we got to know each other really well, sort of compared ideas of stuff that we were studying, stuff that we'd learned in the background through work and life experience. And I'd always had this feeling, from about sort of 1999 onwards, that we were going to do some sort of collaborative work together. Because we were just too manic, and we had this huge amount, this sort of reservoir of knowledge, all of which was very useful. Because I'm of the thought that, if you take anarchism on its own, it's not going to do anything. If you take anarchism and you look back at history and take the good bits out of history and the good bits out of all these sort of methods of human learning, then you're looking at putting a cohesive whole together where everything is workable, you know, where we can live sustainably, where you can have sustainable communities, well-being, etc., and not have to work for 40 hours a week for the man. And it was really that sort of coming together and this sort of collaboration of ideas and our experience. And 2.5 years ago, Mike rung me up, I've got this idea for a project, are you up for it? And I just jumped on straight away. I mean, I'm doing bits of permaculture, bits of guerrilla gardening, bits of permablitz, all sorts of stuff, pocketting things out of the park, that when I'm not working, that provides a bit of an income. All sorts of tinkering and anarchic goings on. So that's my little...
Yeah, I come from a bit of a different background. I got politicised basically through the rave movement. So in the early 90s, like 1990, 91, I used to go to a lot of free parties, used to go to spiral tie parties and stuff like that. And it was through that I became really interested in alternative culture. And then I also worked in the voluntary sector doing benefits advice in an unemployed community resource centre for about 5 years. So it was a combination of that, the fact of seeing all this inequality, and then also seeing how the rave movement was really clamped down on, going to like criminal justice act marches, you know, being around a bit when the poll tax stuff was going on, and all these sorts of things. So I was politicised from a quite young age that actually what's going on is a bit wrong, you know. So it was like, that was how I sort of got into this sort of stuff. But then we went to Ruskin, I went to Ruskin College and met Steve, and it was there then that we actually got to understand a bit of what's going on, because I'd always sort of didn't really even understand what capitalism was as a dynamic or anything until I went to Ruskin, even though I saw this poverty and this stuff going on. But it wasn't really until I went there and went to university that I had a much better understanding. And it's sort of, from moving through that, I also run a homeless charity in Gloucester for about 6 years for young people, where we saw about 500 young people a year. So again, it was reinforcing these issues, and also been involved in Bristol Indonesia and other groups in the Forest of Dean and in Bristol. And one of the big things for us was, in setting up permanent culture now, was to try and get people who, because a lot of people talk about, there's a couple of talks today actually, when Steve's going to do a talk after this about urban permaculture, about how you can provide a lot more for yourselves in a small environment in a city. And then there's also a talk at 5 o'clock about, is permaculture political? And with this project, what we're trying to do is make links between different groups of people. So there's lots of people who go, well, you know, I'm just into permaculture, I'm not really interested in politics or this sort of thing. Well, we're like, well, you can't really, if you're going to be into permaculture and take these ideas on and these ethics, you know, the permaculture ethics, which influenced our project in that they're like people care, earth care and fair shares. I mean, that is the fundamental ethics of permaculture. Then really, you know, you're talking about a different society. And we're trying to make people think about the links. We're not saying you should listen, you should have to agree with the stuff that we put up. But what we're saying is, you know, it's really interesting to understand, say, about enclosures that have happened, why land's so expensive, why you don't have access to land, you know, on a practical level, why, you know, when we're told at school, you know, you're taught the history of the ruling class and the elites and kings and queens, and they say, oh, you know, it's like as if the UK was this really like peaceful and placid development to where we are now, which is complete and utter bullshit, because there's always, you know, there's been huge amounts of resistance to land enclosures. You know, you have people like Wat Tyler, the levelers, the diggers. I mean, there's a whole range, which we talk about on the site under the history section. And it's about, so we were thinking, like, we've got all this knowledge and it's really good stuff, and that we want an outlet for people so people could access it as well. And one thing I read a couple of years ago was about, like, I think it's very easy to assume, especially say like an event like this, lots of people come to it, and you assume that everyone sort of has the same understanding or has read the same things as you. And actually, especially with the younger generation, people are only just starting to discover these ideas. So we thought what would be really good is just to put it all in one place and go, right, here,
access this.
Read this. This is what we find really useful. This is what we think's useful to know. And here's backup for your arguments, really. So if someone saying, well, it's always been like this, well, no, it hasn't actually. It's only been, neoliberal capitalism's only been around since really the mid-70s.
Yeah.
And before that, capitalism was only around for a couple of 100 years. Before that, it was a very different way of living. So we've decided to focus on different aspects on the site. So, you've got one of the main things which influences us is permaculture principles and ethics as a way of doing things. And the ethics is a way of, acting, I suppose, as sort of an umbrella for lots of different ideas. So we're not saying, you have to be an anarchist, or you have to be a socialist, or you have to be this. In fact, I would say I'm really sympathetic to lots of the ideas in lots of different realms of theory and history and things like this. And I think it's more about not being dogmatic about things and just using, I see these ideas and things as tools, and tools which you can use for different things. And because we talk a little bit about tyranny of the ist, if you label yourself as an anarchist or a communist or whatever, sometimes that can be quite narrow.
Yeah, well, people pigeonhole you immediately. I mean, we were talking about this the other day. If you look at Charles Eisenstein and Sacred Economics, I don't know how many of you have read any of his material or seen his videos. What he's actually advocating is pure communism. And if you look at Mark Boyle, the moneyless man, the actual, if you had a true communism right at the extent of getting rid of money, and what Mark Boyle's advocating is a form of eco-communism. So I used to call myself an anarchist when it was 2021. I wouldn't do now, because as soon as you use that word, you're aggressive, petrol bomb throwing, Tory hanging, although that wouldn't be such a bad thing hanging them all. But you get all these labels thrown on you immediately. And, I'm an anarchist, but I'm also a socialist, a human being, a gardener, a wanker occasionally when you lose it a little bit. You're everything, aren't you? You're not just one thing. And I think, that sort of echoes in our diverse approach, really, in a way that you can't just, because we're not one thing, are we?
No.
And nobody ever has been, and nobody ever will be.
I mean, we're really interested in the idea of the commons, which is actually gaining a bit of a resurgence now. But I think I'm more interested in sort of how umbrella ideas so you can have things which influence the way you think. So you can have the ethics of permaculture, which is earth care, people care, and fair shares. And then that can sort of as a fundamental, I suppose, as ethics you can use that. But then you can use also lots of other things to achieve your aims. So if we're going to have a change in a way, a social change of social movements, I think it's about trying to, take on board lots of different ideas and utilise them in a pragmatic way.
Yeah.
So at some point it might be useful to use this, or other times you might think, oh, I'm really inspired by what they did there, but maybe they're not anarchists, maybe they're, they were socialists or whatever. But it's about, I think, building up a storage of skills and knowledge, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah.
And the other thing that we really want to do with the project, now we've got quite a substantial amount of information on there, is we ask lots of people. We've got a guest post policy, so we really like other people to write stuff for the site, because it's actually quite exhausting to have to write everything. So we have had a couple of people who've done guest posts. Probably have about 5 or 6 guest posts now, and the idea is that it becomes a much more interactive project, really. And we want people to go, oh, actually, have you seen this? This is really useful, have you thought about this? And we don't necessarily have to agree 100% or whatever with what's going on, with that idea. It's more like, obviously, we wouldn't, if it's racist or fascist ideology, so fuck off. But, as long as it's, falls within the reasonable realms, we're quite happy to put anything up there. So it's about trying to pull together lots of different ideas and get people to think about things in a much more holistic way. So if you took the example of, say, permaculture, when people go, well, actually permaculture is not political, or not, I'm just a gardener. Well, we would say, well, actually, there's loads, you could take permaculture and you could apply that to every topic that we cover on the site. So you could have permaculture principles and ethics used in education, for example. You could look at why the history of permaculture, the history of land enclosure, the history of food growing. you could look at, there's the theory which links in with permaculture, because if you're talking about people care, earth care and fair shares, then really you would possibly be looking at communist ideas, or anarchist ideas. Then you could look at self-reliance, obviously, because you're growing your own food. So we see all these things that really cross over, like in lots of ways. And if you can have a much more holistic overview, then one, I think you can do things more successfully. It makes it stronger because you understand, like, okay, well, maybe we're using this land here, but fundamentally that might be taken. So you understand, like, actually what's the dynamics of land occupation and these sorts of things. And I've had a conversation with lots of people about permaculture, and I've said, like, it's fine at the moment. If you start to become a real threat in the way that it's operating, and food supplies and things like this, you may find that actually there's a lot of interest from the state in what you're doing. Because it was a bit like, because people go, I'm just growing food, I'm not doing anything.
Particularly in America and New Zealand at the moment, some of the stuff that's happening over there is really disturbing.
Like stopping people growing food in their gardens.
Yeah, and there's a guy who I'm friendly with in Detroit, and he got a letter through his door about 3 weeks ago saying, because you don't own your home, you can't keep chickens in your back garden. And that's absolutely absurd. He's got a bloody back garden about 3/4 of an acre, and he only keeps about 4 chickens. And then you've got the raw milk thing, and you apparently have to be licensed to sell raw milk in America. And there was a raw food cooperative that weren't licensed, but they told the authorities that were doing it. When the police turned up, they were around with Kalashnikovs and stuff, and they had people on the floor with fucking barrels of guns in the back of the neck over raw milk. So there's talks of, I'll mention this a little bit in my next talk, but there's some documents that are currently being interpreted by various people about banning seed saving, banning home food growing, etc. But things like that really need to keep an eye on it, because some of it is, I wouldn't say conspiracy theory, but I think some of it's people jumping to conclusions. I'm sure some of you are aware of Codex Alimentarius, which is it's the food industry's equivalent of the IMF. Now the IMF is supposed to be an independent organisation. Obviously it isn't. It's got bankers paying into it left, right and centre so they can have the decisions weighed in their favour. Now this Codex Alimentarius is supposed to be a voluntary code for food, for vitamins, nutrition, etc. And somebody found out a couple of years ago that Monsanto were paying into, and I think that's what started the thing, because Monsanto were involved, who are absolute scum of the earth. Straight away that makes Codex Alimentarius a suspect movement. But anybody that wants to follow up on it, I'd actually consider, emailing the American government, the people in the department, and emailing the New Zealand government. There's a bill put before the New Zealand Senate about 3 years ago, and it doesn't actually say you are banned from growing food or saving seeds. So I think we need to tread really carefully with it, and you put your research head on properly, and really delve into it. Because the difference I've seen with it, if you want to call it the ecology permaculture movement of the 2000s, compared to the sort of anarchist traveller movement in the 80s, there's an awful lot of conspiracy stuff knocking about, chemtrails and stuff like that. Absolute and utter bullshit. Whatever evidence, people come up with the geoengineering argument, and the geoengineering of letting aluminium particles out of plane exhaust pipes hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen in about 10 years' time. There's just been a conversation about it. We've got all these people running around Sunrise Festival, New World Orders, bloody 10-headed reptiles, chemtrails. And while all that bullshit's inside people's mind, and neoliberals are in your back pockets, they're stealing your money, they're stealing your rights, and it's just all an utter smokescreen.
Yeah, that's one of the other things. There is a lot of conspiracy theory stuff, and it's like, I always say, well, like, it doesn't have to be a conspiracy theory, because just look at what they're doing. They don't hide anything. Yeah. It's like, just last week, the head of Nestle was interviewed for some film that's being made, saying that he believes that the water supply should be completely privatised, and that all people should pay for water. Not like a public service, like people should buy water as
What
they do.
did he say, Mike? Was it isn't a human right to have access to clean water?
And these people
are sort of scum come up with stuff like that.
When you just see, it's like you just see what the, like I always give the example of Tony Blair. Tony Blair took us to war on a lie. We all know that was a lie now. He now works as an envoy for some weird Middle East envoy, and also works for JP Morgan and gets £5 million a year. And that's like absolute common knowledge. It's not like this isn't a conspiracy. This is like this is obvious. So my argument is always with conspiracy theory stuff is like they don't need to have.
Yeah.
There doesn't need to be a conspiracy theory because they've been doing it for hundreds of years.
I mean, playfully, I look at it as the two Daves. You've got the two Daves. You've got Dave Icke and Dave Holmgren. Fuck David Icke and go for David Holmgren. That's where you're going to find your truth, all your practical stuff, all your community building stuff. All you're going to find from David Icke is paranoia, insecurity, and is this true, is that true? And, he's basically a sports commentator who's made a nice living out of coming up with all these weird concocted Masonic fairy stories.
I mean, the other thing with permanent culture now is to try and link the like ideas with practical action as well. So it's like it's not just like completely abstract or we're saying look, there is stuff that you can do personally in your lives to help. Whether it be growing your own food, whether it be getting involved in different groups, doing activist type stuff, thinking about the idea of the commons and how land can be taken back, all these sorts of things. So it's trying to also make a link between abstract ideas, history, and what you can do on a personal level. So it's not completely disempowering, because sometimes you can go on, you can get a lot of projects can be like, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening, and it's really like, whoa. And it does feel a bit like that at the moment, in terms of there is massive moves to privatise everything as we're seeing in this country. But also then, it can get like quite, people can burn out quite quickly with that sort of thing. So we're sort of trying to say, look, understand this stuff, do the practical things that you can do, but also if you've got this understanding, then you can be more effective in exactly what you're going to do. So if you're going to put a lot of effort into something, just be aware of what the best way of doing that is, really. Yeah,
I mean, there's a great danger with permaculture as well, and if anyone wants to throw a brew over me, please do, but make sure it's cool rather than a hot one. A lot of people seem to think they can just pick permaculture up and just fuck everything else. And it really isn't the case. I mean, permaculture is an incredibly dynamic and diverse way of working with nature and community building, etc. But it will not do on its own. It really won't.
Because there is a lot of the other thing we're interested in is how do you? Because it's all very well if you've got a bit of money and you can go and buy a bit of land and set up your small holding in Devon or whatever, and try and exist in that way. But the majority of people don't have access to that. So we're thinking what the fuck's going to happen to Barton Hill? When peak oil can hit and food's becoming more expensive and issues with water and all these sorts of things, is how a city's going to manage with these problems, because you're just, and it's a zero-sum game anyway, because if you go off and you set up your small holding or whatever to live this sort of ideal, when the shit hits the fan, do you not think that people aren't just going to come from the city and go, actually, we're just going to have your farm because my kids are really hungry, and there's 400 of us and there's 3 of you. So it's like everyone's got we think that we have to be moving together, all of us, towards working out how we're going to deal with the issues that face us in the future, because we're still sort of at the end of, we're still sort of living off the labour of others at the moment, really. I mean, it's still cheap enough to import food in, all these sorts of things, but a lot of this stuff is going to hit walls soon. We're going to have to become a lot more self-sufficient in this country, and this government doesn't seem to have any inclination to even put anything in place in respects of what they seem to be doing is taking away as much as they can away from people, and away from giving people any sort of independence and self-reliance. So, which is where, when you look at the idea of the commons, you look at enclosures. Enclosures is about privatisation, and it's a really interesting. I mean, we talk a lot about it on the website, because you used to have common land in the 1600s where people could just go and use the land, etc., to meet their needs. Then it became enclosed, which created scarcity, which then involved forcing people, it's basically what happens in China and other countries now, forcing people off the rural land where they were reasonably self-sufficient. All right, they might not have been earning loads of money, but they were able to meet their needs into a wage situation where you had to go and work for other people. And you can see this dynamic of enclosure is really important, because you can see how enclosure happened with land and now happens with all things. So when you get Monsanto talking about we want to patent the genes of trees or the makeup of different plants, because what they're doing again is they're enclosing something which was once common, which was once available to us all, monetizing it, selling it back to us and controlling it. And you can look at everything. I mean, ideas, patenting, land, music, art, culture, all of it is slowly been enclosed by capitalism in order to make a profit. Whereas a commons argument is that all this stuff should be available for free. So you imagine if all this stuff was available for us all to use and maximise for the good of human well-being, it's almost like we automatically think we can't do that, we can't do this because it's copyrighted, we can't do this because that land's apparently not ours. It's all these things which currently go on. The ideology is really strong. The neoliberal ideology has really seeped into the consciousness of a lot of people, and maybe not so much people here, but in general, the ideas of just taking land and using it, and that being yours, or just being able to use ideas and things. A lot of people just don't see that as a possibility, because they're so used to paying for things, buying stuff. And we're sort of saying, well, no, there's like a whole movements now. There's whole new movements evolving, which are really interesting. So, for example, you have like open source ecology movement, which is basically an open source production sort of system. So people upload plans, like for example, here's how you can make a tractor for 18 grand, and they give you all the plans and everything. So it's like taking like Creative Commons ideas and then applying them to a practical. And
they don't suffer from the built-in obsolescence either, do they?
Yeah, so it's more like modular.
Yeah, when you make something, a tractor, your 18 grand tractor is going to last 10 times the amount of time that a massive Ferguson thing that's got built-in obsolescence, it'll last 5 years maybe, and that's it, gone.
I mean, you've also got obviously things like Creative Commons now. So there's whole movements that are actually looking at how to share stuff, and if we share things and ideas and how we can set up communities where people share stuff. So rather than like the whole street, everyone having their own lawnmower, for example, you can have one lawnmower which everyone uses, or you have tools which are shared. So there's like lots of ideas that we promote on the site around these sorts of issues. And the other thing I think which is quite interesting, which we'd like to do more of, is showing how, because sometimes it feels like that there's, especially in the UK, I think that it can ebbs and flows. At some points it seems like there's loads of stuff going on. Other times it feels like there's very little in terms of alternatives to the dominant neoliberal agenda. But when you look at what's going on in other countries, particularly like South American countries and Central American countries, there's massive changes. Like countries, for example, which one's the ones that banned Coca-Cola from the country recently? Was it Peru?
Yeah.
Bolivia?
I think one of the Latin American countries has brought in ecocide as a crime where, and it won't be sort of punished with 50 grand fines like you get over here if you pollute the River Severn. These fines will bankrupt companies because they really do give a shit about nature. But there's also, in a lot of the Latin American countries and a lot of other countries, European, they've been kicking Monsanto out left, right and centre for the last 3 or 4 years. And the amount of good stuff that's going on outside of the UK is absolutely incredible. I mean, in America you've got there's 50,000 cases of organic farmers against Monsanto. And the way Monsanto tried to deal with it, they thought they'd be clever, and they said to the judge, well, we'll deal with them all in one day. And the farmers went, fuck you, we want every single case being seen individually. Now, over the years, that's going to bankrupt Monsanto. You've also got in India, you've got the Indian government collaborated with Vandana Shiva, and they've got about 40 or 50 charges against Monsanto for biopiracy. And basically what Monsanto's biologists have been doing, sneaking into India, and all of India's sort of seed stock is it's all been protected by law for the last 3 or 4 decades. Monsanto have gone in and they've taken sort of varieties of aubergine that are really popular in Europe, stole some of those seeds, stole some courgette seeds, stole a bit of gourd seeds, gone out of India, made their own versions and then tried to sell them back to Indian farmers. Vandana Shiva's gone, well, hold on a minute. She's sort of linked up with the government, so at the moment I think Monsanto have got about maybe 60,000 cases against them globally of people who are very serious about taking them to court and doing them. But all this really great stuff, unfortunately, is going on outside of the UK.
They seem to have, it seems to be, other countries seem to have much more progressive governments at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, we unfortunately, just sort of like, I don't know how, I was saying this the other day, how did we end up in a situation with these people governing us is beyond me. I mean, it's like they didn't even get a mandate. You know, so the situation is pretty dire. Hopefully they're not going to be around for much longer.
No. For me, one of the scariest things about neoliberalism, apart from, you know, the cataclysmic effect on ecology, the inequality, the poverty and everything, and this is a real fucking scary thing when you think about peak oil and peak resources in general, is the lack of skills that people have had since consumer capitalism's brought in. There's guys who I work with some ex-offenders last year, and the extent of their cooking skills were making a cup of tea, boiling an egg. And that went across the board with all these guys, and they're a real mix from different communities and different ethnicities. And nobody could do anything because they've had it done through consumerism. It's like, well, no, you don't have to make it. Why make it when you can go to Argos and pay a fiver for it or whatever? And I think when these peak resources start hitting town, you know, all these people who've been like effectively like babies feeding on the teat of consumerism for the last 3 decades are going to be fucked. You know, it's going to be, well, how do we do this? And a lot of the work I do is most of my work that's linked to permanent culture now is all practical permaculture stuff. You know, I ran a permaculture course for armed robbers and, you know, people who've done serious courses last year, and I just called it gardening with nature. You start using a big word like permaculture and you start mentioning the anthropological side and the biology. You know, these are working class guys who've never been to college or anything, but with the gardening with nature thing, it was able to explain it in a really down to earth way, and they understood every last little bit of it. And it also, I mean, these guys, there was 14 of them, absolutely hated each other. They were all from different gangs around Manchester. By the end of the course, because we were all getting involved and all getting a real buzz out of it, we were all mates. Now, I didn't go in there with the idea of community building, but it's that thing of if you share skills and there's no ego or gain for anybody other than, yeah, mate, have you tried this? It's a really fucking powerful thing. You know, I'm sure any of the workshops that you've been to, you know, I do rocket stove workshops and cob workshops and all sorts of wacky stuff. And you can see people with massive smiles on their faces at the end of it because you know that they're going to go home, get in the back garden and start tinkering. You're going to get all the tools and the bits out and start making stuff. And you can't buy that. You know, sharing skills is a fucking incredible thing. Not to sound too hippie, but you know, you build community, you give people levels of self-esteem where perhaps they weren't very dexterous before. You know, I mean, I had this guy who'd been banged. He's done 30 years for armed robbery, and I made some bread with him, and he made his own loaf, and he was jumping up in the air with this loaf. Fucking hell, man! I've made something. And
I was a bit like that when I made my first.
He's not. I mean, I'm not saying this is, you know, like the be-all holy model that works, but he hasn't convicted sin. So, you know, and yet again, I didn't go in there with those intentions of, oh, I can sort you out. I was invited to do a project called the Sow and Grow Project by NACRO, Criminal Justice Charity. And I just smiled when they offered it. They thought, right, let's get some stealth undercover permaculture in it. And it worked, and hopefully they're going to have me back later this year.
I mean, the other thing with doing things like that is that you're bringing ideas to people, so people are doing something, and then you can start to talk about different things. So it's like there's different ways in, and that's why we have so many different topics, I suppose, on the site, is because, you know, someone might come to it and read about history, and then like have a look at the permaculture section, or or maybe someone comes to permaculture, has a look at the history of the commons bit.
Yeah.
And it's like, so we're trying to say, look, you know, all these things sort of cross over really a lot, and it's about also building like
really.
Not just it being an alternative thing, you know, not just being like, you know, here's something for the anarchist community, or you know, it's about trying to get these ideas into a much wider community, you know. So we do, you know, like Steve does a lot of stuff with people who would never come to the Anarchist Bookfair, you know, because they're like, they just wouldn't even.
No, and it's important as well, and I don't want to sound too classist here at all, but working class people there isn't any point to where they're going to come across permaculture. So, and I quite value the fact that now, I grew up on council estates in Manchester. I got into learning and education through being a punk originally. I was into like press and dub reggae and all that. And that's what started me off reading. So I feel like fortunate and privileged the fact that I can go back into my own community and unravel and take all the intellectual language away from everything and go, all right, mate, you've got to make one of these. Literally, and they'll just sit down and you do it. And it's something that you can, if you get rid of all the barriers and everything, you can show people stuff really quickly and they get it straight away. So, my real aim from permanent culture now, apart from getting rid of fucking neoliberals, capitalism, the age of reason and all the other fucking garbage, is I want my mission to be getting working class people into permaculture, and getting asylum seekers and refugees who are a great people resource. I mean, I had a chat with Patrick Whitefield's sister Christina, and she was telling me about Somali people that moved into the tower blocks over in Easton. And she was saying that they were that poor that if you looked at the tower block at night, there was no lights on at all, so they couldn't afford to put fibre in the electricity. So they thought, let's outreach. They're obviously lonely up there, and they took some of the Somali guys to some of the permaculture projects, and straight away the Somali guys were looking at the trees and and they sort of the little bit of language you have between them, and they've shown Bristol permaculture lot how to graft fruit trees. And you've got all these skills from these traditional, because a lot of refugees and asylum seekers are from sort of agrarian communities, and they're not from consumer capitalist high-tech cultures, so they've still got all these skills. And when they come over here, it's a great way of them integrating the fact that they can share stuff with us. And you're never going to forget, if a guy from the desert in Somalia shows you how to do something, you're going to remember that forever. Because those cultural interactions literally don't happen because of all social barriers, because of race, because of hidden racism, because of people, paranoia about, is that culture going to accept me? Are they going to be are they going to be hostile towards me? So all these barriers are, and it's just about, I see everything as a resource. I mean, people are the biggest resource you've got, really.
Well, and the most powerful thing.
Sure.
I mean, we believe in that there needs to be a mass movement of people with practical skills and with nous to know what's going on to affect change. And that's one of the reasons. It's just like passing on knowledge. And there's this thing about every generation has to learn anew what the previous generation has. So we're always, there's whole new people always learning the stuff that we already know. So we're hoping to just produce a resource where people can go easily access it rather than having to buy loads of expensive books or all this sort of stuff.
And most of the stuff we do a lot of the stuff we do on the website, we do both engage in it on a personal level. I mean, Mike's a really good filmmaker, quite good at sort of writing the narrative for films, etc. I've been gardening for years. Mike gardens. We've both got a lot in the plots. So everything that we're sort of doing on there, we're doing at home as well. And I think that's a good thing. I think you've got to keep it real, because it'd be too easy for somebody. There's a permaculture tutor. I want to mention this briefly. There's a guy up north, and he doesn't garden at all, but he's a permaculture teacher. He doesn't have anything to do with applying things to soil and nature. And it's just, I find that frankly a bit bizarre, really. Obviously it's up to him if he wants to learn gardening, but I don't know.
So we're going to
keep it real.
I'll tell you a little bit about why we've chosen what we've chosen today to got the stuff which is happening in here, and then we have Q&A if anyone's got any questions and stuff. But we decided to Steve's going to do a talk next about urban permaculture, which is basically like practical ways of being able to feed yourself in a small urban area. So if you've only got a small area of space where you can grow food, there's loads of things that you can actually do to get quite a lot of food, growing, like vertical growing, all sorts, loads of stuff, which Steve will talk about. We've got another guy doing a talk after that on commonising capital, and it's a guy, Martin Large, who's from Strode, and he's been involved. He wrote a book called Commonwealth, which is how to restructure society based on a commons model, and he's going to talk about how you can take capital, i.e. money, out of the system and invest it into other projects, but set those projects up in a way that people can't, that capital then can't be removed. So it's like, I think he's probably going to talk about maybe there's a brewer's stuff, and there's quite a few projects. There's loads of stuff which happens in Australia actually, but there's some projects he's been involved in, and I think it's like how how to set stuff up without it then being co-opted back by capitalism. So you set up something that goes really popular and everyone's got shares in it, and then everyone maximises the profit off the shares. I think they set up things in a way that you can't do that, so you always retain the same amount of value in the investment. So it's quite interesting how to move money out of the system into a different model and keep it there and use it for good. Then we're going to have, me and Arvind are going to do a talk about indie media, because we think alternative media channels are really important, and we're going to ask people to give us feedback on what indie media is, how they find indie media, and suggestions for new ways that it could be utilised, because it was set up in 2001 where you couldn't even have a blog. Facebook didn't exist, there was no social media, so it was like at that point it was a really important sort of model, but I think it could be changed and adapted for 2013. Then we've got a talk by Reclaim the Fields and Building Man, which are two projects about reclaiming land. So Reclaim the Fields is a project set up in the Forest of Dean, and they basically took over this quite a lot of land, which is, I think, from what I gather briefly, is that the guy who owned it is now dead. Some arsehole solicitors found this out. They set up this thing where he pays people to go and work the land for a bit, and if you do that for a certain period of time, apparently you can claim ownership of the land. So they found this out. They've now squatting the land and trying to challenge this and trying to set that up as a community sort of resource. And then there's the Building Man project, which I don't know if anyone's ever been to Clay Cookie Land Festival, but it's the same people who are sort of involved in that. And their ideas are behind this idea of the gift economy, and what they want to do is set up permanent festival sites around the UK, because one of the most expensive aspects of putting on a festival is all the infrastructure. So you'd have to have like big marquees and toilets and all this sort of stuff. And so what they're trying to do is go around, get loads of people involved on a voluntary basis to set up these permanent areas that all different groups could then use. And then there's a panel discussion at the end about is permaculture political, where we've got Steve, another friend of ours, Alan, Zoe from Eat Project, and Mike Feingold, people probably know, having a discussion about is permaculture political, or is it just basically gardening? Lazy gardening. It's a good description of permaculture in some ways. If you set it up right, it's lazy gardening. And and then we've also got, there's an allotments talk over in the shack bit over there. Thing about herbal medicine at 3:00, and then a rebel sing-along happening over there as well. So there's loads of stuff going on today. But I'm going to shut up now, and if anyone's got any questions, wants to know any more about the project, then let us know. I was just going to go.
Sort of educational stuff in Bristol at the moment?
The only thing really is that I'm involved with the Radical History group as well, so I help them putting on events. But mainly, no, not really. Apart from like the monthly indie media nights, which are about different projects. But what we try and do is with the monthly film nights or talks, depends on what the night's about, is have work with different groups. So this is another big thing, is like highlighting issues and then saying, look, here's a group you can get involved in. Because we used to, I've been running the indie media film nights for quite a few years, about 5 years now. And it used to be, we just used to show a film, and then it'd be like, so you'd watch this film, you get really angry about whatever the topic was, and then it'd be like, oh, and then you just go home. And we're thinking, oh, that's a bit shit really, because then you just go home really frustrated, like, look at fucking bastards, mobile phones or whatever, like. So what we're trying to do more and more so is try and link in with, either go, look, come and talk about your project. So the last night, which was linked to the Bookfair, was about the Stop G8 campaign. So we had people Stop G8, we showed some films, and then you could get involved in that. There's we've got one about fracking coming up, which is put on by the Save Less Fracking group. Solidarity Federation are doing the next talk, which is about housing and the housing crisis. It's particularly around, obviously issues with the bedroom tax, and the fact that there's not very little council housing, affordable housing. So we tried to do that, I mean, it would be great if people wanted to engage and be involved more with the project. To actually, it would be good. I'd like to do, like, for example, we got a section on there about radical history, and then so we got this book which highlights all the people's movements for over about the last 400 years, and we serialised it, and then we've had why we think it's relevant for permanent culture now. So there's all the women's rights. It could be like land issues. It could be like about activism. It could be about resistance, all these sorts of things. I'd really like to do a course on that, to show people that actually these ideas aren't, these aren't new ideas. And this is another big thing with education. Actually, is like we don't need to reinvent the wheel. A lot of times people are reinventing the wheel all the time. Where actually all these things, Occupy comes as a history in, with like the levelers, the diggers. You could look at all these movements, and it's funny. I always say it's a bit like a line which surfaces, and goes underground, and then comes back and under all the time throughout history. So you're always having like Win Stanley was arguing for equality and a commons-based model. As were the diggers as well. And
same themes resonating through history.
Yeah, like William, the cooperative movement, Rochdale pioneers, and it's all stuff I've only done a lot about in the last 5 or 6 years. It's just like, oh my god, there's this whole history of stuff. So it would be really good to sort of set up. I mean, I was chatting to a friend of mine the other day about, really good to have an alternative type university in Bristol, really. But again, it's like massive amounts of people's time. Well, I haven't got time to dig the allotment at the moment, so.
I mean, in terms of workshops, I can do permaculture-based workshops in Bristol. The only reason why I haven't, apart from the obvious thing of being based up north, is that there's probably stuff that I do going on here already.
Yeah, there's
probably stuff that Mike Feingold does, that Sarah Peary does, and other people. But if there's anything specific, I'd certainly come down for a weekend and do some stuff.
Yeah. I mean, as been said, we have thought about doing like a weekend, a similar sort of thing to this, but smaller, but with 2 days worth of stuff, getting people in and more around these sorts of ideas. It'd be really good to do a conference or some sort of event around the commons, because that movement's really growing at the moment, and not only at a theoretical level, but also there's lots of groups signing up to these ideas. So something like that. But if anyone wants to help out, get involved, then just contact us.
Just the last thing about the Commons, if anyone's in any doubt of how important it is, there was a meeting in 2011 between all the major global bankers, and they decided that in the next decade we're going to get rid of anything that's common and collective, even down to charging people entrance to parks. So there's going to be no public spaces and no public sphere at all if these bankers get the way. So the Commons is really right up there with permaculture and with the community building and everything else.
Yeah, I mean, a classic example of a recent enclosure in Bristol is Cabot Circus. Cabot Circus was common land. Now you cannot walk into Cabot Circus without permission. It's a private space. Try taking a photo in there, in Cabot Circus, and see what happens. People will come up to you. You've got to go and speak to the desk, wherever that is. It just reminds me of an ant farm. I can't bear it. But you can't even take photos in there. And that was common space. This was common land, and it's like this happens all the time. And it's just it's like drip feeding privatisation everywhere. But any other questions or people want to ask? Yeah.
A comment really. I'm really sort of fully in line with your sort of eclecticism, sort of holistic sort of approach. I'm just interested whether, do you find kind of resistance to that in more sort of like, purely doctrinal circles? I suppose I'm just.
What do you mean, like in?
Well, some purists here today might sort of scoff at what you're talking about. But for me, I agree with you that we have to kind of take, we have to selectively take what works, and that no one model will be, because that kind of dogmatism. If I walk into that, that hall and just get some dogma at me, then I'm walking out the room.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
So that's really counterproductive, I think is what I'm saying. So it's very refreshing to hear a kind of something which is more inclusive and eclectic.
I mean, well, I would.
But also thoughtful, not just a mishmash.
Yeah.
You know.
Oh yeah, there is a framework to what we, you know, we're not just saying that just all this random stuff. We're saying that if you're interested in social change, you need to fundamentally, if you cannot feed yourself, any ideology isn't going to feed you. So, and they know that, which is why land was enclosed. You know, they took away the ability to provide for yourself. So, you know, you can talk what you want about anarchism, socialism, all these ideas, which are great. You know, I'm not saying that they're shit or anything, but you know, you have to think about fundamentals. How do you build a sustainable way? And this is why, when we say permanent culture now, we're not saying that this is like you reach this panacea and then that's it. It stops. What we're saying is there's a base that we need to be at, a sustainable way of living, which then you can build on top of that sustainable base however you want. You know, but at the moment we've got a situation which is based on growth, right? And growth is fundamentally destroying the planet.
Yeah.
And if we carry on the way we're going, we're fucked. So, like, you could, you know, fundamentally, you know, you won't be able to drink the water. The environment, which is the biggest commons there is, which is constantly being destroyed, is, you know, you need to address these issues. So this is why we say, like, you know, to have a. That's why we chose permanent culture now, because we get a lot of flack actually at times on. I'll tell you what we get flack about is being political.
Yeah, off permaculture people.
Yeah, on Facebook. You can see we got a Facebook group which is a bit like our forum. So I put something up about, yeah, it's great Thatcher's dead, you know. We really believe in people care. She didn't care for people, you know. And then it's like, oh, you shouldn't disrespect the dead. And I said, no, we do respect the dead. We respect all the people who were killed under Pinochet, the people who lost their jobs in the miners' strike, you know, the people who got murdered in the Belgrano. And it's like, oh, you're just a permaculture site. You should, and we're like, well, no, we're not. You know, and it's actually, that's quite interesting because I think it's challenging people to actually think. So we're saying, no, we do believe in permaculture, yeah. We believe in fair shares, people care and earth care, which fundamentally means we probably ain't going to like Margaret Thatcher.
Permaculture does have radical roots, you know, despite this, I don't know what you want to call it, this esoterical sort of hippie thing that's caught on to permaculture. There really isn't any of that. I mean, if you read Permaculture 1 and you look at, you know, Bill Mollison is implicit. If it isn't permaculture, isn't dwarfs, elves, pixies, yogurt weaving, this, that and the other. It isn't all that at all. You know, and in my next talk I'll tell you about an amusing bit about where I did my introduction to permaculture, which was very over-the-top hippie for something that's basically rooted in the sciences. You know, but that's another talk. You know, the esoterical side that people are attaching to permaculture. To me, it seems obvious that it's come from when they've been exploring the earth care ethic. You know, I mean, I'd probably describe myself as, you know, elements of my beliefs are pagan, but they're not dogmatic. It's very down to earth and very not rituals attached to it and pentagrams and all that. It's more a feeling and, you know, and it's a genealogical thing going back. I mean, that's why Christianity hasn't survived in the UK. So all the fucking churches are empty because it was imposed on us. You know, it's a ridiculous and absurd.
Now, mate.
Exactly, mate. Fucking good point. Yeah.
We're using the church for the right thing.
Yeah, we've reclaimed the church.
Yeah.
We've re-enclosed the church.
Yeah.
If only for a day.
I think Mollison's actually very explicit about this point.
Yeah.
He talks about the cycle of radical resistance. He talks about the 1890s, the 1930s, the 1960s. And sees permaculture in that cycle of sort of a re-emergence of resistance. And Holmgren also talks about Kropotkin.
Yeah.
In his book.
Well, when you just read his stuff, you can see that where he's not a right wing. He's not a right wing. And I mean, anyone who wants to know a bit more about, I think like permaculture as a design system can be applied to the whole thing. You know, could be applied to your personal life, can be applied to how communities can operate, and you can also. What's great is that you can then bring in ideas from anarchism and socialism, and I think there's synergies between things, and that's what's really important. So I think dogmatism's really not. You know, you need to be open to where you move. You shouldn't just be going right just because someone says something in 1830, you know, or 1840. Bakunin wrote this. You know, we can't do this in 2013. It's, you know, these are tools. It's always like. There's a really good quote by a guy called Richard Rorty, who's sort of a pragmatist, you know, is sort of philosophical thinking. But he said theory is a terrible master but a very good servant, and that's one of the overriding things. You know, ideas are great as if they serve your purpose, but not as the overriding reason why you do things. That has to be decided amongst us now. What's the best way to do what we're doing now? Work that out. And if someone says, oh yeah, well actually anarchism's got this really good, you know, consensus decision making is really good, or, you know, actually yeah, it would be good if we operated a society in this way, structured it in this way. You know, then you're like, you know, you can be dynamic and more fluid with how you respond to things. So I think that's really important.
Yeah. Sometimes, I mean, you know, if you want to call it hard politics, whether it's left or right, it can be very, restrictive, really, in how you think. And I think, you know, for this new world that we want to create, we have got to put a lot of creativity in it, really. And we don't need sort of over-rationalised and rigid systems saying, well, you can't do that, can't do that, you can't do that. I could be wrong. I don't know that. They might
be one way of getting that. You know.